Hi, I'm Femi OK. Today on the stream, Kenya wants 2 huge refugee camps closed, and it's demanding that the United Nations does that immediately. But what do you do with more than 400,000 people when the host country no longer wants to host them? If you're on YouTube, this is a conversation that you are very much invited to be in. Jump into the comment section and you too can be in the stream. But right now, let's start with some perspectives from people who know what it's like to be a refugee.
With mixed reaction in the refugee camp, most of the refugees think it is not safe for them to be taken back to their home countries, which they left because of insecurity reasons, and now they have been forced to be repatriated back home.
I think it will either force Kenya to violate the international laws and treaties that it has been party of, or it will endanger the lives of refugees who sought asylum in Kenya, who Kenya hosted for well over 30 years. And it will not be proper for the Kenyan government to carry out such a step.
People believing they will be forced back to their countries. This is not going to be voluntary repatriation, because most of the refugees we have seen so far are not going to be voluntarily involved in the deportation.
Thoughts from people who've experienced refugee life in Kenya. Joining our conversation today, we have Irungo, we have Mwenda, we have Catherine. Good to see you guests. Irungo, tell everybody who you are, what you do.
Good evening, and thanks for having us on the show. My name is Irungo Houghton. I serve Amnesty International as the Executive Director for Kenya, and I'm based in Nairobi.
Welcome. Hello, Mwenda. Introduce yourself to our international audience.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mwenda Bijiwe. I'm a security consultant based in Nairobi, Kenya. My work is mainly in counterterrorism.
And if you haven't seen Catherine Soy's work on Al Jazeera, you're not watching Al Jazeera and you're not paying attention. Catherine, remind everybody who you are and what you do.
Yeah, my name is Catherine Soy. I'm a correspondent based here in Kenya, but I mostly cover Eastern Central Africa.
Good to have you. Now, this is not the first time that Kenya has demanded that refugee camps be closed. Let me take you back to the Minister of Interior in 2016. Have a look.
I want to inform the world through you that the decision to close the Dadaab camp is final.
Well, not quite that final. This is March 24th of this year, when a Ministry of Interior in Kenya says, we're giving you 2 weeks, United Nations, UNHCR, which is the UN agency that takes care of refugees, giving you 2 weeks to come up with a plan. Catherine, how come we are revisiting this story again, this situation again? The Minister of Interior in 2016 said, this is final, the camps are closing. Now what?
Well, it's not quite final. And let me just start by saying that this matter is now in court. There was a petition that was filed, and the judge put an injunction on the government from doing anything on the camps until the case is heard in a month's time. So the genesis of this, Femi, as you mentioned, is this announcement by the Interior Cabinet Secretary in March, giving the UNHCR an ultimatum to come up with a report. And the UNHCR did come up with a report, first talking about all the challenges of repatriating 430,000 refugees in these 2 camps, Kakuma in the northwest and Dadaab in the northeast. So the UNHCR says it's impossible to do this in the middle of a pandemic, and the protection of refugees should be a priority. There were also proposals in that report. So the UNHCR said that the government needs to give it time for voluntary repatriation to go on for the refugees who are supposed to be settled in third countries, and also ask the government if it could consider community reintegration, particularly of refugees who have been here since the start, refugees who were born in this country and who feel that Kenya is their home country. So this report, these proposals have been rejected by the ministry. I think I saw some media reports that the UNHCR was asking for some time, I think until the end of 2022, just to put the logistics in place. But the government has said, no, we need a more reasonable, more acceptable time frame. But then the minister is also toning down on his much very combative stance that, ultimatums and things like that. So the minister says that there's still room for negotiating. So the UN and the Ministry of Interior are still talking. And I don't think from his tone that there's going to be any drastic action anytime soon.
All right, Orongo, what do you think sparked this initial, we want the camps closed now?
Well, obviously, I can't speak from the government of Kenya, but I think they have said a couple of times that they have concerns about environmental degradation in places like Dadaab, in the 3 camps that are there. They have major concerns about the 79% funding gap from the humanitarian bodies. There is concerns, and of course, we're in the middle of a diplomatic tiff between the Somali and Kenya government with regards to who owns, who controls parts of the Indian Ocean. So these are some of the other issues. But I think the one that we've heard most consistently is the issue of national security. And I think this has to be put in context. In many ways, we're not back in 2015, 2016, when we saw attacks on our universities. We saw a number of very brazen repeated attacks on Kenyan soil. This is a particular period which it seems to be a lull in terms of attacks by al-Shabaab. So it's not really clear at this moment why this national security imperative is being brought forward. And I think we should also mention that besides the case that Catherine spoke about in the High Court at the moment, in 2017, a High Court pronounced a judgment that said you cannot visit an evacuation or a decampment program on 512,000. Let me correct that figure that was said earlier. We have a combined number of 512,000 people, refugees in Kenya. And you cannot decamp all 500,000 of them on the basis of the fact that some of them have been engaged in terrorism, even if they are in the camps. This would be ludicrous if you tried to attempt this with a medium-sized town, essentially to arrest or to displace a whole town just simply because you want to go after a few violent terrorists. So I think these are the arguments that we've heard from the government.
All right, so let me bring in Mwenda here. Mwenda, this is a YouTube comment from Brian Mwangi. The Dadaab camp is more of a terrorist breeding camp than a refugee camp. Mwenda, pick up that thought.
Thank you. Actually, government's main concern right now has been national security. There are reasons like my fellow panelists mentioned, environmental funding and all that, but the main concern, which takes about 80% of government's reason to want to close these refugee camps, is national security. And this is also, mentioned in the refugee, in the Geneva Convention for Refugees, that a government or a hosting country, they call them contracting country, can actually even interfere with issues refugee when there are issues of national security involved. And so the government of Kenya, since 2011, when our forces crossed over into Somalia to pursue the terrorist group Al-Shabaab, there was increased terrorist attacks all across this country. There were attacks, in universities, in shopping malls, in churches, and these attacks culminated into an intelligence report where government has the responsibility to find out where are these problems coming from. Lately, in the last year or so, there have been almost countless IEDs planted on the roads, roadside bombs, killing mainly police and security agencies in that region.
Mwenda, I just heard Orongo say that there haven't been as many attacks recently, and you're saying something completely different.
Actually, I would actually want to differ with him because there have been increased roadside bombs and IEDs planted on the roadside. One as recent as 2 weeks ago, where it missed the security van that it was supposed to blow and blew up a civilian bus, killing a handful of people and injuring so many others. So there have been an increased. The
every one of these attacks you can trace back to Dadaab or Kakuma. Is that what you're saying,
Let me jump in there.
Because if you're not, it's not relevant, is it?
Let me jump in there.
I am not government spokesperson.
Aronga, go ahead.
I can't say definitively if it came from the refugee camps. But out of their intelligence reports, they say they have found sleeper cells in the refugee camps that are aiding these terrorist attacks.
So I was just going to say that, you know, the argument, and I think we have to really be careful about the language. I mean, the idea that refugees are somehow like mosquitoes, that they breed in swamps, in camps, this is xenophobic and actually prejudicial against people who have essentially fled out of fear and a lack of security themselves. And that is the reality for many of the people in the camps. Yesterday, a young 22-year-old Crichton Tuwera, an LGBTIQ activist and refugee, died of a firebombing that took place in Kakuma camp about a week ago, and or a couple of weeks ago. And you know, we've had other cases where many of the refugees actually, rather than perpetuating acts of violence, are actually fearful for their own lives. And I think this is the reality for the majority of people in those camps, and painting the entire camp as a training camp for Al-Shabaab or any other terrorist group is actually patently false and just not borne out by the evidence. It is definitely the case that there have been, and I don't want to minimize the loss of our security officers or people who have died as a result of the IED attacks that Mwenda is speaking about, but I think it's really critical to make the point or to ask the question, is there concrete evidence that these attacks can be traced back to the camp, or are these essentially cells that are coming across the border from Somalia and, for that matter, are a danger not just to Kenyans, but to refugees as well?
Let me make a quick interjection here, and I apologize to cut you, bro, but really, the government will never reveal what intelligence they gathered. They will never make it public that we spied on someone's phone, we looked at their phone data, we followed their contact, and this contact the refugee camps. But when government speaks and when the Minister for National Security speaks, I think we owe him some sense of duty to actually believe him or respect his opinion, and that being the opinion of government. And if he says we have traced sleeper cells into refugee camps, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that he means it.
All right, let me bring in Catherine here. Catherine, on YouTube, our viewers are talking about, this is Osman. Osman, thank you for being part of this conversation. Talking about a maritime dispute with Somalia. Abukar picks up on that dispute. Have a listen to his comment, Catherine. Come off the back and put it in the context of the idea of having to close 2 huge refugee camps. Is there a connection? Have a listen to Abukar.
Now, I understand the Kenyans are not very happy with Somali government at the moment due to ongoing maritime case between Kenya and Somalia and ICJ, the ban of cat from Kenya to Somalia. But closing refugee camps, it's not the answer. The only people who are going to benefit from it, it's the likes of Al-Shabaab who are going to recruit such a vulnerable people. It's counterproductive. It's not good for the peace of Kenya, not good peace for Somalia, and not good peace of as a region as a whole.
That relationship between Somalia and Kenya, could that be behind the idea of almost 500,000 people having to find new homes?
Well, the minister has said there's no link between this diplomatic problems that Kenya is having with Somalia and what the announcement that he's made. But then a lot of people are saying that there is a link, but because the relationship between Somalia and Kenya has been frosty for quite a while. Somalia has often, for example, accused Kenya of interfering in its political affairs, especially in the lead up to the election, which has now stalled in December. Somalia cut diplomatic ties with Kenya. And then there's that issue that he talked about, the maritime dispute with both countries claiming this 100,000 square kilometer triangle in the Indian Ocean that is said to be rich in gas and oil. Both countries claiming that the other, each country is, exploiting and, leasing those some of those blocks. There's a case in court. Somalia sued Kenya at the international ICJ. Kenya has withdrawn from that case. So even if the minister says that, whatever is happening now is not linked to, the frosty relations, a lot of people are saying that perhaps this is a way of Kenya putting more pressure on Somalia to tone down.
Guess let's talk about logistics then, because we're beginning to understand, get a more clearer vision of perhaps what might be behind Kenya's decision to want the camps closed finally, eventually. But what about the logistics? This is Devon talking about the logistics. Have a listen.
If the Kenyan government were to close the refugee camps of Dadaab and Kakuma quickly or without proper plans in place that respect international refugee law, it would be absolutely devastating for tens of thousands of refugees. There are about 430,000 refugees from at least 15 different countries in the camps. Most of the refugees living in Dadaab are from Somalia, and many of the refugees in Kakuma are from South Sudan. So where would they go? What would they do? Somalia certainly isn't safe to return to, and many parts of South Sudan aren't safe either. Also, many of the refugees were born and raised in the camps. All they know is Kenya. So the Kenyan government has a responsibility to find some sustainable solutions.
So many questions Devon posed right there, but the logistics, Zirongo, the UNHCR have been trying to repatriate people, then they ran out of money, and Kenya seems extremely serious this time around about those camps closing. What logistically can be done?
Well, I think the plan that was put forward by the UNHCR that has been rejected by the government in terms of its timetable raised some of the complexity of this. I mean, first of all, not everybody in these camps is going back to Somalia. You've got people from the DRC, upwards of 5 to 6 different countries that you would have to repatriate or relocate over this period. And I think the first thing to say is that, I think as Devon has said, is that we've had 30 years, and one of the reasons that I'm proud to be a Kenyan is that I come from a country that has provided sanctuary for refugees for 30 years. And the numbers comparative to some of the countries that are much richer and much more wealthy, really, there's no real fair share of responsibility on this. But I think Kenya has done this out of an obligation, not just in terms of our international respect for international conventions, but also our own Kenyan law that we have a responsibility to protect. But I think the logistics just simply cannot be done in a haphazard way. Let me just give you some of the complexity. The first is that, obvious one, we're in a pandemic. There has been no plan to vaccinate any of these refugees to make sure that they can be repatriated safely. And for many of these countries, there actually have been bans on border crossing of borders at a point like this. The second option would be for them to be relocated to third countries. Now, we've seen with even prior to COVID, but definitely during COVID, that many countries have actually stopped their resettlement plans. And therefore, countries like Norway, Sweden, and Canada that have historically been supportive are not doing this anymore. And therefore, there is no option really to settle them in third countries. And the third and most important thing really is that many of the countries, as we've heard already by some of the refugee spokespersons, is that many of these countries are unstable, they are violent, and they have weak states. So we are very much faced with a situation that, like in 2015 and 2016, we repatriated voluntarily, and it has to be voluntarily under international law, 86,000 people. But many of them returned because there was simply no schools for their children to go to. There were no livelihoods for them to pick up, and there was no, healthcare available for them. And I think the last one, perhaps, maybe is thinking about this, is that, for many people, we tend to forget that many of these people in the camps are, born in those camps. They have got married in those camps. They are as Kenyan as many of us who live outside of the camps. And for that reason, this is a delicate process that needs to be managed with care and ensuring that we do not have a haphazard and disastrous humanitarian operation at this point.
See, Catherine, I know you've...
jump in there, yeah.
Catherine, you've done stories about Dadaab camp and Kakuma camp, and you've spoken to people who've lived there for big chunks of their life, if not all of their lives. So I know you're not there right now because of COVID, but can you explain to me how many of the people that you spoke to, they think about Dadaab and Kakuma, and when they are in a position where that may not be their home going forward, what do they tell you?
Let me just first very briefly speak about the voluntary repatriation that Irungu was talking about. In 2016, I extensively covered that repatriation, and I did speak to people who were going back home, and I called some of those people in this period who are still in IDP camps in Somalia, unable to get health care, unable to just get their basic needs. In 2017, I went back to Dadaab, and I spoke to people who I had interviewed going to Somalia, and they had returned to the camps because it was too dangerous in their home areas where they had gone to. So the situation is more or less the same. I have spoken to a lot of people in this period, and I mean, their sentiments are just like it was in 2016. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of fear. A lot of people who are born there are like, where are we going to go? And, you know, in Kakuma, for example, we have refugees from, you know, other countries in the region who still feel that it's very unsafe for them to go back. And I spoke to them as well. So they're very worried about that. They're aware that, you know, the court blocked things in 2017. And now there's also a court ruling. Perhaps it's government rhetoric. But a lot of people are saying that, you know, this thing keeps repeating itself. So what if one time the government makes good its threat? Where will they go? So that is a sentiment, a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty in those camps.
I want to introduce into our conversation, the closing moments of our conversation, Israel. He's an international security researcher. I'm going to put his thoughts to you, Mwenda. Let's have a listen.
For me, I believe that the alternative, or rather the sustainable solution to this challenge, is that we should look at an approach, a humanistic approach that integrates the views of both parties. Kenya has cited its national security issues. We shouldn't neglect that. But also, the move will affect the human security of the most vulnerable, especially these refugees, and we shouldn't neglect that.
So what I'm hearing then, Mwenda, is there's a negotiation that has to happen, that is currently happening. What do you think is the best case scenario that we could hope for?
Thank you. Actually, I'm very delighted that after the announcement by the minister, there has been almost, activities everywhere. The wheels are turning, at the international level, in the local levels. In fact, the one party that is missing in these negotiations are the mother countries of these people. I have not seen representatives from South Sudan or from the government of Somalia or from DR Congo, Eritrea or Rwanda, where some of these refugees come to the table and say, hey, we are interested parties into these negotiations. But as the government has made this announcement, all these players are all coming to the table. And as my brother has aptly said in that clip that you played over there, the security researcher, yes, we need to listen to each other. This is the international system. In the international system, there are no absolutes. We listen to each other. Kenya presents their case. The refugees and their representatives in UNHCR and human rights groups, Amnesty International and others, present their views, and people listen to each other. If we listen to each other, for sure there's going to be an amicable solution. And I tell you, the ultimate solution that the government of Kenya is looking for is the safety of its people, the safety of the city, of its security agencies that are working in these areas, the safety of the citizens of this country. Do not forget that the government's first responsibility is to its own citizen. It needs to secure this country, no matter the price it has to pay for that.
I'm just looking here at YouTube to some of the comments that people are reacting to, guests, as you are actually speaking. Yusuf says that Kenya alone cannot reintegrate the number of people in the camps. It's important to recognise the challenges Kenya faces in relation to the camps being open and growing in size. It needs collective action. This is going to be an instant reaction guess. 5 years' time, will Dadaab and Kakuma still exist? Irongo.
Well, we don't know, and I think Mwenda's point about dialogue, I think, is critical.
Right.
It's important
critical
that all
is
the
dialogue
different...
is critical. Mwenda, Dadaab and Kakuma, will they still exist in 5 years' time?
No.
Catherine?
I think with the amount of pressure the government is putting on UNHCR and other partners, I don't think they will exist in 5 years' time.
All right, will I be here in 5 years' time to do that show? Who knows? Thank you very much, Catherine, Mwenda, Irongo, and YouTubers for your comments and your questions. Appreciate you. I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.